So, Andrew, thanks. Where and when were you born?
I was born in Philadelphia, PA in 1968.
And what month? Because I'm interested in your astrological sign.
Oh, okay. I'm October. I'm a Libra, but on the cusp of, what is that, Scorpio.
Yeah.
Right, right at the end of Libra.
So, if we're going to deal with stereotypes and generalities, Libras tend to like balance, fairness, justice. That's a key motivation for them. Is that true for you?
Yeah, I think that is a pretty fair description of me.
Okay. Um, Growing up, what messages did you get about how a boy becomes a man?
I don't remember anything specific or particular. Like nobody ever really took me aside and said, this is what guys are supposed to be like. There was a lot of kind of implicit. It's in the air we breathe. Um, to the extent that anybody did take me aside, it would usually be a peer, another kid from school or for summer camp being like, guys don't do that. Or a lot of comments like, you're such a girl, or only girls do that. Um, there was a little bit of, don't be a fag, but in the 70s and 80s when I grew up, that was not nearly as common as it was, say, 10 years ago. It was much more, that's a girl thing.
And what were examples of behaviors that were considered don't do that, that people think you're like a girl?
Um, so being too concerned about appearance, um, as a boy in the 80s, whether or not you could wear a pink shirt became a thing. Um, but it was also a period when guys started to wear earrings, and depending on who you asked and exactly what year or what day of the week or whatever, um, you know, only gay guys wore earrings, or gay guys would wear an earring in their left ear, but straight guys would wear it in their right ear, or I could have that backwards because it certainly seemed to change while I was a teenager. Um, there was stuff like that. Guys having long hair, that had started to become a thing in the 70s, but I was alive in the 70s. I have some memories of the 70s. And, could you be a guy and have long hair? And I did eventually have a mullet. So, I went there.
Well,
But
long hair it wasn't gay, it was being a hippie, I think.
right, but that was not really an accepted thing, right? That was kind of counterculture or protest. It certainly wasn't mainstream. I was a big sports fan growing up. I am still a big sports fan. Like, there were no professional football players who had hair long enough to come out under their helmet.
Oh, right.
There were rock stars who had long hair, but there were no, say, country stars, and male pop stars may or may not have. Like that was really an influx kind of thing. No baseball players, no hockey players, no basketball players. Um, like that was really an influx kind of thing in that moment. Today, guys have long hair, like, well, think twice about it.
Ornstein in her book about boys and sex, and Way in her book about teen boys, I'm sure you know those books well. They both say that the fear of being considered gay keeps boys from having close friendships in their adolescence. The close buddies that they loved in elementary
Mhm.
school, but they won't say they're homophobic. They'll say, I'm accepting of gays, but I don't want to
Right.
be seen as gay.
Yeah, yeah, there is definitely teen boys do a lot of what in the jargon is impression management. And, there are real concerns. A lot of teen boys, not all teen boys, but a lot of teen boys have real concerns about being too emotionally open with their male peers, even a best friend, because they are concerned how their best friend or potential best friend might respond to that, and whether that's too much. We had through the 2000s, and I think this has mostly gone away. There's this expression in common use, no homo. Like, I'm not homo or no homo, but I have to tell you, like, about how I'm feeling or about how good your body looks. But it had to be prefaced with that expression. And it's not like parents would sit their boys down and say, okay, if you're going to be talking to your friend, you have to make sure he doesn't think you're gay, and you have to use this expression. Like, that just kind of, quote unquote, naturally occurred in the culture, and that's really within male culture. Like, there was no parallel for that in girls' culture, where girls would say no dyke or no lesbo or anything like that. It was just among teenage boys and young men. So, they clearly were feeling this need to, be clear that when they were being more emotionally open than they otherwise might, or when they were complimenting another guy on his body or his appearance, they felt this pressure to make sure that everyone understood that they were straight.
I want to come back to teen boys because that's a specialty of yours, but I want to find out first your education and career path. What led you to be a therapist?
Sure. So I will pick this up as an undergraduate. I went to Virginia Tech. I was a dual major, or I'm dual degreed, so I actually have separate pieces of paper on my wall. I have a degree in psychology and a degree in mathematics. I continued on for, excuse me, I continued on to a graduate program directly from undergrad. I went to Towson University. Excuse me, and got a degree in clinical psychology. I got that degree in '93, so that we can be clear about my age here. At that point, like, I definitely went through undergraduate not really having a career in mind. I started off as a math major, and I did finish that degree. I picked up psychology along the way. It was
Why?
the first course that I took as a gen ed that really interested me, and where I was actually, like, quite willing to do the homework as opposed to just needing to do the homework. And then I took more, and it just kept being more and more interesting, and I kept taking more and more. And at some point I said, oh, I should, like, major in this. And at the same time, among my friends, like, I was one of the people, and maybe the person, I don't know, but one of the people in that group that, friends would come and talk to me when they had really difficult stuff going on. So I got to senior year, and I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I knew at that point I didn't really want to stay in mathematics. I was like, oh, like, maybe I should go be a therapist, because I seem to be good at that. People seem to pull that from me. So I did. I went and I became a therapist. And so I worked for the next 5 years in the Philadelphia suburbs, and went back home there. And I wanted to work with teenagers, and that I had some experience in that during my graduate program. And one of the things that I realized as I was doing that was that probably 70% of the kids that I ever worked with, or families that I ever worked with, it was about a teen boy. And I seemed to get along with the boys, and they seemed to get along with me, and I seemed to be able to speak to them in ways that were helpful, and I seemed to kind of naturally understand them. And so, like, I had been doing that for several years, and I decided that I didn't want to do therapy forever, so I went back and I got a bigger degree. I got a Ph.D. in developmental psychology. And I thought I would be a professor, and didn't that look great? And you'd have summers off and all that. Little did I know then. So I was fortunate to get into the University of New Hampshire, and the PhD program in psychology there also trains its graduate students to teach. We actually do a one-year practicum in teaching, where we start to teach under our own name. And that was a great experience, and I really, really fell in love with doing research at that while I was there. So I then did a postdoc at the University of Michigan, and I taught in the New York State system, the SUNY system, for a while. Um, and during that time, while I was doing my postdoc, and then while I was in New York, I started dating the woman who is now my wife, um, and she is also an academic. And so finding the two of us finding positions in the same city became quite an ordeal. Um, Part of that is that she teaches law, and there's not quite 200 law schools in the US. So that's a very limited number of potential employers.
Yeah.
And I do research on um, the normative aspects of sexual development of boys and on kind of definitions of masculinity, neither of which are really kind of research priorities anywhere, like the NIH or anything. Like nobody has funding for that. So even though in a lot of ways I looked like a researcher, I wasn't able to get grant money and couldn't really play that game. So ultimately we landed here in Winston-Salem. My wife continues to work for the Wake Forest University School of Law. I worked in the psychology department for a few years, and eventually came back into private practice, or came into private practice. But along the way, I also wrote a few books.
Yeah, we'll talk about them.
Yeah.
What do you know about men's studies? When did it start, and is it flourishing? I've had a hard time getting men's studies people to talk to me.
So men's studies as a distinct kind of discipline, um, the the contours of that are somewhat ambiguous. The two primary organizations that exist now, what is this, 2021, are the American Men's Studies Association, and I think AMSA, the American Men's Studies Association. I think they are now about 25 years old as a distinct organization. They grew out of NOMAS.
Oh,
Um, and I'm blanking on the beginning of that, but it was something Men Against Sexism, National Organization of Men Against Sexism.
yeah, right.
It dates back to the late 70s, I think. And my understanding of that history, and again, this all predates me, my understanding is that essentially there was a split between kind of the academics and the activists. And so the activists all really stayed in NOMAS, and the academics formed AMSA. And again, that is my understanding, having talked to some of the folks who were around then, having read little pieces of the history as they exist on both the AMSA and NOMAS websites.
So are the men's studies people like Harry Brode, Michael Kimmel, Bob Brennan?
Yeah, yeah.
Anybody else who comes to mind who was
Okay,
foundation?
so that's kind of the AMSA history. The parallel is in psychology, which is Division 51 of the American Psychological Association, the Society for the Psychological Study of Men and Masculinities, plural, of which I am a past president. And that group is strictly psychologists, or almost exclusively psychologists. Non-psychologists can join, but it is a division of the American Psychological Association. So those folks only join as affiliate or associate members. I don't remember the terminology. And the vast majority of the folks in that organization, it's about equally split between full-time academics who publish research and full-time clinicians. But again, all trained as psychologists. And so they also produce a lot of literature. Many of those folks identify as men's studies, but not all of them. I don't understand why that is. The two organizations don't really have ongoing formal connections or work together. But to the extent that there is an academic field called men's studies, like those are the two groups that the academics would tend to belong to.
Did you ever teach men's studies when you were an academic?
There was one semester. I could do it once or twice. I think just once, but it might have been twice, where I got to teach a course in gender development. And again, I'm a developmental psychologist. That's my doctoral degree, and my research is very, my training is in child and adolescent development. Some of my research is really developmental, looking at changes over time. So I did get, I want to say it was 2 semesters, but it really might have just been one, where I got to teach a course on, how the two, and we'll just talk about two here, how the two groups, male and female, grow up and how they differentiate and what messages get stressed for each of those two groups.
Do you remember if any men took it, or was it mostly women students?
Um, I had a couple of guys in there. I think it was about 3 to 1 female to male, but that also tracks psychology as a major. Um, the last couple decades, psychology has become more and more female oriented, and I think our undergraduate population was about 3 to 1 female to male, so it tracked the department patterns, and it was a senior level elective, so they had to be majors or minors in order to take the course.
See if you agree with this or not. As an academic for decades, what I saw was people said that academia is more petty and more, infighting than, say, the business world. And what I observed is in meetings, men would take turns talking to kind of be heard. And women, I know this is a vast generalization, but I really saw it, women would want to get the job done. And I thought, well,
Oh.
maybe these guys were not the popular jocks in high school, so here's their chance to be like the alpha males. Do you think any of that is a fair statement?
So I will tell you that one of the faculty members in my doctoral program, was very fond of a Kissinger quote, and I don't quite remember it, but it was something to the effect of, only in academia are the fights so bitter when the prizes are so small. Um, I did not have the experience that you're talking, the gendered experience that you were talking about. But part of the reason and part of what I appreciate, not being in academia anymore, um, as as an academic, and this kind of showed up in our job search and how we ended up in North Carolina. Um, they're not. It's very difficult to change jobs, and it's really the only industry where it is so difficult.
Because
There are
of
a lot of
tenure.
places. Pardon?
Because of tenure. It's so hard to
Uh,
get tenure.
yeah, because of tenure and the way the system is, but also because there are so few, relatively few positions open, because there is so few, the way you advance is so limited. If I were in banking, right, like there's always another bank in town. That other bank might be looking for a new branch manager, somebody at a more senior level, or a new regional director, someone from outside the organization, to shake things up or whatever. That rarely happens in academia, where they look for somebody at a more senior level to shake things up, in an academic department, or even at the level of, say, an associate dean. Those hires or those positions are really internal only. Maybe a dean search is external, but not until you get to that level is it external. So it's incredibly difficult to shift institutions. And also, my experience of academics, all of the PhD folks, is that they're all really good at learning how the system works and playing the game. And most of them are not particularly interested in kind of taking risks or creating change that would dramatically change the organization.
Yeah, because then you're not going to
Academia,
get tenure.
right, because you're not going to get tenure, which is kind of the point of it. But like, you hear lots of people making the comment that academia, as a field, academia is incredibly slow to change. But and I like that makes sense to me. Having gone back for my doctorate when I was 30 and putting 5 years into my PhD program and another 2 years into a postdoc, like they taught me how this system works and what to do. And I don't know that I would want to throw out all of that. Like it makes sense to me. Like I wouldn't necessarily want to throw out all of that
It's publish
training.
or perish.
Right. And like having spent 7 years trying to get into that system, like I don't want to dramatically change that system in a way that is potentially going to disadvantage me.
Sure.
Um, and also structurally, like, I was on faculty, um, like anytime we made a change to policy, that change had to be grandfathered in across 4 different years of students. So even just structurally, change was slow. There are people for whom that works. I am not one of them.
If you were gonna do a men's studies course now, what would be the main topics on your list, like an intro, gen ed, beginning men's studies?
Well, I write a textbook for that course, so I would probably just go through my textbook. We would talk about first off, like this whole idea of what does it mean to be a man, right? What is the definition of manhood or masculinity?
Is this the masculine self book?
Just the masculine self, yes. We would talk about health. We would talk about violence. We would talk about, and health, both physical health and mental health. We would talk about violence. We would talk about sex, because that's the other thing that I did research on. Talk about work. I know that that's 5 topics and there's 15 chapters in the book, so I've missed other things. But, as the guy who writes what is now both the longest selling and, as far as I can tell, most popular book in this field, not that there are that many people teaching the course, like I would use my book and I would teach what's in my book.
You probably have a chapter on men of color, sexual preference, orientation kind of stuff. I would imagine the diversity stuff.
So there's a chapter on sexuality. The diversity stuff is mostly woven throughout the text. One of the challenges in talking about men, certainly in writing a textbook or doing interviews, men are not a homogeneous group. And anytime we start talking about a group of men, like we necessarily need to get complicated and nuanced. And yes, there are some generalizations that we can make because 60 or 70 or 80% of men do it. But, in order to get beyond those broad generalizations, like we need to get into the details. And as the author of a textbook, I want some of those details and some of those differences, even by ethnic group. Again, not that everybody in any particular ethnic group is the same, right? There's still a lot of heterogeneity within any group, but at least we can start to differentiate. So there's not a chapter that really talks about different
right. That's the way
subgroups in that way. It gets more woven in.
That's the way it should be. I'm really interested in how much there's kind of a debate, nature, nurture, how much of our behaviors as men and women and whatever differentiations there are is genetic and how much is socially constructed. And the men's movement kind of divides on that, and the women's movement does. So the radicals say it's all socially constructed. Other people say, no, there's a brain difference. Men think more in systems and women are more affiliational. So I wonder where you stand in that.
I think it is both. And as a developmental psychologist, our training is very clear and our knowledge base as developmental psychologists is very clear that that it is both. And we can split up the environment into different levels. You're probably familiar with Bronfenbrenner's model, the kind of bullseye image, right? He's got 4 or 5 different ways that we can think about the environment. The folks who do the physiological work talk about it at, the level of DNA and hormones and systems and neural networks, and we can do analyses at each of those levels. So it's all in there. It is all important. We know, again, from the land of developmental psychology, we know that things like learning language and learning to walk are hardwired. And also that it's not just, in our genetics and in our brain development. We know that exposure to certain things, exposure to multiple languages, or lack of exposure to any language, or lack of ability to have free range of movement, like those environmental inputs have huge impacts. And so, even these things that are heavily biologically based, like they're still not 100%. And then other things that we know that are very much cultural, like clothing choices and clothing options. Like even there's still some biological elements that play a part. So the debate is whatever. It's some interesting things to talk about, but the reality is that both the biology at whatever level you want to discuss and the culture, the environment at whatever level you want to discuss, like they are both playing a role all the time.
An example of the physiology that's interesting is the idea is that men get more upset and disconnected in emotional arguments, say with a partner, and so they're more likely to retreat. And then Sue Johnson said, then the woman's like, come back, and he's pulling away, and it creates a vicious cycle. So is that an example of something where there is a physiological difference?
That is one physiological difference. And again, like, those are the gross level patterns when we look at, we're going to make a generalization about men and women, but we know that not all men are like that. And we know that not all women are like that there are some men who say, no, wait, I want to keep working this out. And they don't have that flooding experience. And there's some women who are like, no, I need to go be alone, but yeah, that is definitely an example of another place where, there is definitely a physiological response. But we also know that there's training, development, what we've learned about how do you deal with conflict and how much have you been taught to pay attention to your inner world and really understand it and to verbalize it. And again, at the gross level, there's all sorts of male-female differences there as well, but, that plays in and how much that reflects any given individual's biology, how much that reflects kind of a culture leaning into these gross level generalizations. Like we can debate those ratios all day long, but ultimately, like you and I still have to live our lives. So even if you're in a group that's 80%, you might be 80% the other way. Who knows?
I'm reading a book by a woman physician who says that it's called Why Women Remember and Men Forget, something like that, and she thinks there's physiological genetic differences in what we focus on and that kind of thing, that our brain hemispheres, women are more connected. Do you buy that stuff, that we have brain differences?
Again, at the level of broad generalizations, like absolutely there are differences there. Is it going to help me with the next person I meet on the street? Not really. We know that estrogen, and everybody produces estrogen, and everybody has estrogen in their system. We know that estrogen plays a role in memory formation. Like if you talk to the people that study memory, like they will, if they know the physiology, they will tell you that estrogen plays a key role. Women certainly talk about that, when they go through menopause. Like my memory is not as good. It's a fairly common thing for women in their 40s and 50s to say, as they go through menopause. We know that on average, after puberty has started, women have much more estrogen than men do. That is part of what puberty does for us. So, it follows that women should have better memories than men. But again, not, there are some women who are low in estrogen, there are some men who are high in estrogen. As an academic, as someone who went to more years of school than I care to count, a big part of school success is developing your memory and your ability to recall a whole lot of stuff. My memory may be better than it should be based on my physiology because I put in all of this extra training. So yeah, there are probably very real physiological differences, which again describes us at the group level. That doesn't necessarily tell us anything about the next person you're going to talk to.
What patterns do you see in your clients, the people who come to see you, like the men who come by themselves or the couples who come?
Right.
Over the years, can you say, oh, they come because of this and this works to help them resolve that problem?
Oh, yeah, yes, and I could talk about that forever.
Oh, good.
Um, the my description, my website says that I work with folks about age 15 to 50. Um, I am I am a let's see, I work exclusively with teen boys and adult men, but that is my specialization. Like as far as actual presenting issues, I'm a generalist. So if you're depressed or you're anxious or you have attention deficit disorder or you have sexual issues or you have gender identity issues or a half dozen other things, like I might be the right therapist for you. I don't work just in depression or just in eating disorders. So I hear I deal with men and couples and families around a whole range of issues. Um, I work with a lot of guys who have low self-esteem, and we work on that and why don't they believe in themselves. Some of those guys, but also guys with other issues. We do what was called assertiveness training when I was coming up in the 90s, and it's not. I think that is still the name. But that's not taught in graduate programs anymore. Um, how do you find ways to express yourself when you are struggling? How do you, instead of just avoiding confrontation or instead of verbalizing your concerns in a way that are so subtle that the other people around you might not get it, whether that's your partner, or your kid, or your boss at work, or a colleague at work. Deal a lot with anxiety and just helping people cope better. Work a lot, with folks who have attention deficit disorder and what does that really mean and what are all of the ways that it manifests in their life and how, again, what can they do to both fit in better, but also for the folks with ADD and across the board, to recognize when they're in an environment that doesn't fit them and maybe change their environment, right? It doesn't always have to be the individual making changes and trying to fit in. It can be the individual saying, this is not the right place for me, and maybe I should go be somewhere else. Maybe I should get a different kind of job. One of the conversations I often have with parents and also teens who have ADD is whether or not they should expect their kid to go to college. If you are having an argument with your teenager every day about how to do their homework, you as a parent, and you as a parent feel like you need to do their homework almost with them or stand over them to make sure they get their homework done, and this is the routine through all of middle school and all of high school, then it doesn't sound like, why would you think college is going to be any different? And maybe college isn't actually a good idea. Like, the last 7 years have been horrible. Don't sign up for another 4. And so, that is a way to talk about changing the environment that shows up with teens. But a range of things, a range of issues for the folks who come see me, and a range of solutions, again, depending on who that guy really is and what the details are of their life and what they're struggling with.
A lot of boys get prescribed Ritalin, and some people say that just keeps them quiet, and that's not really fair. What do you think about that?
I think that is accurate. I think that Ritalin and most psychotropic drugs are overprescribed. I think that there are a variety of reasons for that, but the biggest one comes down to it's the simplest thing for the adults to do to get the kid to stop being a problem. You know, if all we have to do is learn to take a pill once or twice a day, whether that's Ritalin or Prozac or some anti-anxiety medication, and nobody really has to change the way they behave. Nobody has to, the family doesn't have to rethink how it approaches their kid or parenting. Schools don't have to change how they approach kids. Like, that's the easiest solution, and that's often where we go. Um, I think it's pretty clear that I don't think that's a good idea, but I think that is often what happens.
Well, what's an example of like a behavioral change that you come to where a kid with ADD like write everything down, or you know, what's one way they can cope since they want to graduate from high school?
So one of the things that I do with a lot of kids who have ADD and their parents is talking about what that attention deficit really is. Because kind of at its most fundamental level, what it is an inability to control what you're paying attention to, which also means that you can't split your attention. Um, One of the things that you have to do to be successful in school is that you have to be able to take notes and still listen to what the teacher is saying. That requires you to split your attention and do two things at once. For kids with ADD, that is almost impossible because it's multitasking and they can't multitask. So working with the school to get a note taker or a way for the kid to get the teacher's notes, like that is a way to change the environment, right? So there's less pressure on the kid to take those notes. But at the same time, helping the kid understand that and helping the parents understand that so that the parents don't say, how come your notes look so horrible? And the kid doesn't feel bad because his notes look so horrible. Like that alone can have a huge impact because then you have the kid saying, oh, I'm not such a screw up after all. Like everybody else seems to have this skill and I don't. But they get it that is going to be an incredibly difficult skill for them to acquire if they can acquire it at all, because that is what their disorder prevents them from doing. And so then we talk about, what do they do? What do they really need to write down, and when do they need to write it down? And so we are talking about strategies where they're much more working with their disorder and working kind of around those limitations instead of trying to plow through and overcome something that's going to be incredibly difficult to overcome.
What about anxiety? We know there's an increasing number of teens around the Western world anyway who present with anxiety, and then second with depression, especially girls.
Right.
Is it because society's more stressful, or is it because we just allow them to talk about it, or what's going on with this kind of epidemic?
I'll go with D, all of the above. Um, Life is definitely more stressful. So, you and I grew up in an era before social media and before cell phones, where when I left school, when you left school at the end of day, at the end of, whether that's junior high, because I actually went to a junior high, not a middle school,
Me
whether it's
too.
junior high or middle school or high school, like if I didn't want to see or talk to any of those people from my school for the rest of the day or over the weekend, I didn't have to, and nobody expected me to. And there was we did have telephones, but we didn't carry our telephones with us because they were landlines. So, something might happen and, on a Friday afternoon, and I might not know about it until Monday. And not everybody in my community would know because of the way that social circles or cliques work, right? Like there's still information travels, but it was slower then. And certainly not the whole city or not the whole world would know. But now the whole world potentially knows. You know, yeah, I've gotten people from more or less all over the planet respond when I was blogging regularly. I would get comments from all over the planet. Even now, as an author, like I'll get queries from people all around the globe. Um, that is a whole different level of awareness. Certainly, and teens get that. The teens that I work with, they will tell me, they're getting friend requests from people they met once at band camp or at a sporting event or whatever, and like they kind of don't feel like they can really decline those friend requests even though they've only met that person once, but that person is friends with someone they know, and so they don't want it to get back. So now, like, they're friends with people in the next county over that, again, when you and I were growing up, like, I would never get to see those people again, except, next year at the same game. But now, like, those people are suddenly part of my social media world, even though I don't know them and may not have spent enough time with them to decide if I like them or don't like them. So there's just a lot more eyes on us, and it's almost impossible to get those kinds of separations that you and I were able to get that occurred naturally for us. And so, yeah, there's a lot more eyes on, there's a lot more pressure to look like you have your stuff together, like, kids come out now and whatever flavor of coming out that is, and they don't quite have the time to figure it out that folks used to have before social media. There's a lot more pressure. And of course, thinking about what's going on globally in 2021, we have a pandemic, we clearly have climate crisis, we have, we continue to have a two-party system, but unlike when you and I were growing up, compromise and working together to solve big problems is a bad thing. It was not 40 years ago when I was growing up.
Yeah.
Um, and so there's just the world kind of in and of itself, or at least, American culture in and of itself has a lot more stress on it. Again, as a teenager in the 80s, and especially once the Soviet Union dissolved, like, we were the leader of the world, period, full stop. Like, that may or may not be true here in 2021. It is a very different kind of geopolitical environment in that way. And the kids certainly feel some of that. And, whether they're into the news or not, because of course, they are still getting the news in their social media feeds or getting some news when they go to YouTube to watch some silly video, but there's still a whatever commercial or something. So they're exposed to a lot more stress than you and I were, in lots of ways.
Gene Twenge at San Diego really emphasizes social media. But for me, talking to teens, I think that the social media can be positive and negative, but the main reason they're anxious is because they have so much pressure to get good grades, activities, to get into good college, to get a good job, to pay off their $25,000 and more student loan. So to me, that's the bigger issue is the pressures. And they're working. These American students with all these AP classes are supposed to do sports and work. I mean, they don't sleep. That would make me anxious and depressed.
Yes, that is also true. That is a particular slice of the American pie. I think we're talking about, maybe the, top 20 or 25% kind of by income there. The boys I work with, whose parents are both high school graduates, or maybe not even that. they are not talking about those issues in the same way. They're talking about graduating. They will maybe or maybe not go to a state college. They might be going to a 2 year, and they're looking at trades. So that is a very different dynamic for them. But certainly for those kind of middle class, upper middle class kids, that set of pressures that are really about excelling, that is very real for them. Absolutely.
So the blue collar boys, their pressures are what? To make money?
Um, we don't, blue collar isn't exactly a thing anymore. Most of those jobs have gone away, right? Right? They've all gone overseas. Let's hear it for globalization.
Yeah.
Um, so it's a lot more struggle to figure out kind of economically where they might fit in, especially for those kids who've always been good with their hands, but have always been like a BC kind of student, because they know that they're probably not going to suddenly become A students in college. But, again, I graduated high school in 1986. We had vocational technical schooling, both
Shop
TAC.
classes, they call them.
Yeah, so we took shop. I mean, I took shop in eighth and ninth grade. I learned basic woodworking. I learned basic wiring and all that. That is not part of the standard curriculum anymore. And I was in the gifted track. So even us in the gifted track, we took wood shop and all that.
The boys
And
did.
everybody did, boys and the girls.
Oh.
Yes, we were very progressive in my district there in the 80s.
You have an appointment, so I don't want to make you.
Yeah.
Let's schedule
finish
another
this.
time, but finish.
Yeah. We had a vocational high school that folks could go to. So
Oh.
if you wanted to go into auto
Oh.
mechanics, again, I'm class of 86 here, like, however that worked, you would spend half your day at the vocational high school, and then you would come back to the regular high school. And my impression of their courses back in the regular high school was that their math courses, they started to shift more towards some basic accounting. Their English courses shifted more towards business correspondence, how do you write a contract?
Oh.
Um, you know, like not that some Shakespeare would have hurt them as far as being good people, but recognizing that these were folks who weren't going to go on to college, starting to give them some practical skills or some practical knowledge that they might need once they moved into the workforce, because lots of those folks ultimately own their own businesses, right? They become an electrician working for themselves, and maybe they have a few folks, or they own their own, they become an auto mechanic and they own their own repair shop. That's mostly gone from the U.S. these days. So if you're a blue collar kid, again, we don't use that term anymore, the educational options aren't really there for you. Because, we now, for the last 10 years, 20 years, about 60% of our high school graduates start college within 12 months of graduating high school. There is no economy on earth, real or hypothesized, that needs that many people to have bachelor's degrees. That's absurd. We don't need that many people to be that educated. But our high schools are set up to kind of send everybody to college. So there's a real disservice to kids in general, and more so to boys than girls, because boys are more likely to be going into those trades and have those kinds of interests. But high school doesn't prepare them for that.
Okay.
All right.
So should we end this so that you can go to your, okay.